Hello and welcome to Train Signal. You're watching Creating a Free iSCSI SAN with OpenFiler. In this lesson, I'll talk about why should you be interested in OpenFiler to begin with, and why would you even want to use it to create an iSCSI SAN? Don't you just go out and buy a hardware-based iSCSI SAN? Well, I'll answer why in just a second. From there, I'll show you how to download OpenFiler, how to install OpenFiler as a virtual machine in vSphere, then how to configure OpenFiler as an iSCSI SAN, how to connect vSphere or ESXi to the OpenFiler iSCSI SAN, and we'll even move a virtual machine over into our virtual iSCSI SAN powered by OpenFiler. So with that, let's get started. So what is OpenFiler and why would you want to use OpenFiler to create a free iSCSI storage area network? Well, let's first start off with why would you need a storage area network to begin with? Well, you need a SAN to perform advanced vSphere functions like vMotion, storage vMotion, VMware high availability, fault tolerance, distributed resource scheduler or DRS, or DPM, dynamic power management. These advanced vSphere features require shared storage, and that shared storage is your storage area network. A SAN is really the best way to manage storage once you have a virtual infrastructure. By having the storage area network, you're creating a shared storage infrastructure, just like you're creating a shared virtual infrastructure of servers using vSphere. OpenFiler is an open source, Linux-based operating system that provides storage area network functionality. It's a dedicated SAN operating system. It can be installed on a physical server, and then you can turn that physical server into a storage area network using OpenFiler. So all the storage that's attached to that physical server, let's say the local disk, or maybe you have a direct attached storage on that physical server, all that can suddenly be accessed using, let's say, iSCSI, or even Windows CIFS, or even NFS. So OpenFiler is the operating system that provides that. And if you want to use it for a production storage area network, you can. Actually, you can take a physical server and make it a production storage area network. Now, of course, the downside is that OpenFiler isn't going to have as great of support because it's open source as you would get with a commercially fully supported storage area network. So keep that in mind. I'm not recommending that everyone use OpenFiler for a production storage area network. In my experience, we did use OpenFiler for some time for a small production virtual infrastructure, and it acted as our storage area network. We didn't have very many problems, and it was a good success, but that's not to say everyone should run out and use OpenFiler for their production SAN. Now, OpenFiler, in my opinion, is a great way or a great option for testing, for development, and for learning about vSphere, because you can use OpenFiler, you can create a virtual machine, put OpenFiler on it, and then with just 2 ESXi servers and this virtual storage area network, you could test features like vMotion, storage vMotion, and all these other features I listed here. It can act as a fully functional iSCSI storage area network that allows you to use these advanced features without any money being spent. So from that aspect, it's very cool. On the other hand, it's not going to scale. You're not going to run, let's say, 10 virtual machines or 20 virtual machines off of a virtual OpenFiler virtual machine. If you start to put very many virtual machines on it and you want some performance, then go put it on a dedicated server. OpenFiler is available for download from openfiler.com. It's available in a 32-bit or a 64-bit ISO installer. It installs very quickly and easily, and you can even download OpenFiler as a pre-built VMware virtual appliance with no installation. I typically download the ISO installer because I like to do the installation myself. I just feel better about that, and it really doesn't take very long. Here I am on the OpenFiler website, again, openfiler.com, and they actually do have some higher level, more commercial versions now with support that do have HA failover and replication. So far, I've never tried any of those personally. I've just always gone to download OpenFiler free edition right here. And that takes us to the download page here, where I typically just click on download for the ISO image that works on x86 64-bit. But there are other versions here, such as the VMware Virtual Appliance version. Now, I've already downloaded actually the 64-bit x86 version, and so what I'm going to do now is go over to the vSphere client. Let's create a new virtual machine, and then we'll mount that ISO as the CD image and start the OpenFiler installation process. Here in the vSphere client, to create our new OpenFiler virtual machine, I'll just right-click on an iSCSI server and go to New Virtual Machine. We'll take the typical virtual machine configuration and click Next. I'm going to give it a name. We'll call it OpenFiler and click Next. I'll just take the first available VMFS data store that has free space, which is the iOmega SAN. I'll click Next here. Now we need to specify the type of guest operating system we'll be installing. And I'll just use the arrow keys here, and I'll go down to CentOS. It is based on CentOS, and it is 64-bit. I'll click Next. This virtual machine will just need one network interface card. I'll click Next here. And then now we need to specify how much disk space we want to allocate to the OpenFiler virtual machine. Now, because this is a VSA, a virtual storage appliance, it could use actually a lot of disk space, especially if you want to use it to store virtual machines on. So in my case, I'm just going to do 100 gigabytes, but I'm going to then provision it because this is a lab environment, and I'm not that concerned about performance. I just want to be able to test out things and learn about things. So I'll do 100 gigs, thinly provisioned virtual disk for the OpenFiler VSA, and click Next. And at this point, we're ready to create the virtual machine. I'll click Edit here because I do want to actually remove the floppy drive. I know we don't need that. I'll click Finish. And now the new OpenFiler virtual machine has been created. I'm just going to right-click on it. Let's go ahead and power it on. And then I'll select it. And I'm going to open up the console for the virtual machine. And at this point, it's trying to do a Pixie boot. We don't really want to do that, but let me go ahead and maximize the screen here. I'm going to connect my local OpenFiler ISO image. So I'm going to connect to an ISO image on the local disk. Here's the OpenFiler ISO installation file. I'll click Open, and that'll connect the ISO image we need. And then I'll select the console window here, and I'll hold down Control Alt and I'll press Insert. That'll send a Control-Alt-Delete, and then it'll actually boot the OpenFiler ISO. So now it says, do you want to perform a graphical installation? If so, just press the Enter key. I'll press Enter there, and this will boot up OpenFiler so that we can begin the installation process. And then we're brought to the start of the installation process. From here, we could read the release notes, but I'll just click Next here to get the process started. We're asked to select the appropriate keyboard for this system. I'll say US English by taking the default here of Next. Now it asks if we want to erase everything on the hard drive or the disk that this OpenFiler server is connected to. We know that's the brand new virtual disk that we just created, so I'll say yes here. And then from here we can take the default partition scheme and we'll install that on the 100 gig VMware virtual disk that we created. By clicking Next, I'll say yes, I'm sure I want to do this. And now we need to configure networking. Because this is going to be a virtual storage area network appliance, I recommend you put a static IP address on it, even if it is for a small home lab or learning environment. I'll click Edit here, and then let's go ahead and configure a manual IP address. I'll type 10.0.1.249. And my prefix is going to be 255.255.255.0. I'll say OK here. And now we need to enter a host name. I'll type openfiler.wiredbraincoffee.com. And of course, you need to go over to your DNS server and make a host record for this OpenFiler server that points OpenFiler to the static IP address that we're defining here. I'll go ahead and enter the default gateway for this virtual machine and the primary DNS server. That's where I've made my host alias for the OpenFiler IP address. I'll click Next here. Then we're asked to select the time zone for this virtual machine. I'll just take the default of New York, American, or Eastern Time. Click Next. We need to enter the root password here, which is not for the web interface. It's actually if you log in locally to the console. I'll click Next and Next to start the installation process. So the installation process usually takes just like 5 to 10 minutes. And in that time, I'm going to pause the video recording, and I'll be right back as soon as the install is done. With the installation complete, let's reboot so that we can start our configuration. With the OpenFiler VSA rebooted, the most important thing you can see here is that it did receive an IP address because it says Web Administration GUI, and there's a URL to access it right there, https:// the IP address we specified, :446. So at this point, you could log in as root, but you're just going to get access to the CLI. So I highly recommend you open your web browser, point it to that URL right there, and then we'll log in using the OpenFiler user account. Before we do that, let's go back to our slides and let me talk a little bit more about the initial configuration of OpenFiler. So here's a few final tips about installing OpenFiler before we connect to the web interface. As I said, you should have a static IP address, and you should create a host record over on your DNS server to point to that static IP address. That's because you're going to have ESXi servers pointing to either the host name or the static IP address so that they can access the files in the OpenFiler VSA. And in the case of Vsphare, those files are going to be the virtual machines. So you don't want that IP address to be changing. Of course, as I said, you can connect to the OpenFiler administrative interface through your web browser, and it has to be HTTPS, the hostname, :446. The default web-based username and password are OpenFiler and password. Of course, you'll want to change that password once you log in. And you should also note that the root account will also work for the web interface. However, the OpenFiler account won't work on the CLI interface. So with that, let me go over to my web browser where I've already opened up the OpenFiler web-based administrative interface. All right, here we are. As you can see, I went to https://openfiler.wiredbraincoffee.com :446. So I'm just going to log in here as OpenFiler, and then I'll just type in password for the password. I'll press enter there, and that brings us to the administrative console for the OpenFiler VSA. We get some basic information here about the uptime, current number of users, the load averages, network information, the version of hardware that OpenFiler is running on, and then primarily you'll be navigating through this interface using these tabs across the top, basically menu options here, where you can configure things like network configuration, storage volumes, clusters, quotas, shares, services, and accounts. And then once you're inside those menus, on the right-hand side over here, notice these menu options, because primarily this is how you perform whatever task it is you want to perform. So before we start configuring OpenFiler, let's go back to our slides where I've got some initial configuration steps we'll want to perform. Let's say that we want to configure OpenFiler to act as an iSCSI storage area network for our ESXi servers and our vSphere virtual infrastructure. OpenFiler can actually act as an NFS server as well to store virtual machines and really perform just about all the same functions as it would with iSCSI. But in the case of this lesson, we'll just say that we want to make this an iSCSI SAN instead of an NFS NAS to store our virtual machines and be able to test out the advanced features that vSphere offers. The very first step on the list here is if you're running OpenFiler in a virtual machine, make sure you create a second VMDK before boot. That's because that second VMDK is actually going to be where the files are stored. That's going to be your data store. So the first VMDK that you create is going to be where the OpenFiler operating system is installed. The second VMDK and other subsequent VMDKs would be the actual like SCSI or virtual SCSI volumes that OpenFiler sees and that it can share out using iSCSI or NFS or CIFS, whatever storage protocol you choose. So in my case, if you think back to my installation, I actually already messed up. It's already too late because I created OpenFiler with just a single VMDK. And OpenFiler needs to recognize the disk when it's booted. So actually at this point I have to shut down OpenFiler, add another VMDK, and then reboot OpenFiler. So now let's go over to the OpenFiler web interface. We'll shut it down. Then we'll go to the vSphere client and add the second VMDK and power it back on. To shut down OpenFiler, here from the web interface on the very top right hand, you see Shutdown. That's all you have to do is click Shutdown right there, It asks you if you want to reboot or shut down and halt. I'll take the default here of shut down and halt and just click shutdown. From here, let's go over to the vSphere client where we can add our second VMDK. All right, so the OpenFiler server is already powered off. You can see that right here. We've selected OpenFiler and it's powered off. So now I'm just going to click Edit Settings, and then I want to click Add here because I'm going to add a new hard disk. I'll click Hard Disk there, click Next. We'll create a new virtual disk, and I'm going to add another 100 gigabyte thinly provisioned virtual disk. I'll say Next here, Next, and Finish. Now we have the new virtual disk added. I'll say OK there. The virtual machine will be reconfigured. And then I'll just click Power On here to get OpenFiler back up and running. While OpenFiler reboots, let's go back to our slides and review the remaining configuration steps. Now, besides the second VMDK that we'll need to have added before we boot up the OpenFiler operating system, you should also configure NTP. That's because date and timestamps are critical to authentication. You need to create a partition and a volume. You'll need to verify the iSCSI IQN, which is the iSCSI qualified name, basically a name that corresponds to a particular iSCSI target. You'll need to create a file system and select iSCSI. Then make sure you allow local network access. This is basically a security measure built into OpenFiler. And then finally, enable iSCSI. This is what you'll do on the OpenFiler VSA, and that's completely different from what you do over in the vSphere client for an ESXi server. By performing these steps on the OpenFiler VSA, you could actually connect to this iSCSI SAN, even let's say from your local Windows desktop or your Windows server. So now our OpenFiler VSA should be back up and running, and let's go over to the web interface and walk through these steps. Here in the OpenFiler web interface, the first thing we said we wanted to do is to enable the network time protocol. To do that, I'll go into the System tab, and then I'll go over to Clock Setup. Inside Clock Setup, I'll first make sure that the date and time are correct, and then we'll go down here to the NTP server configuration field, and I'll type in the name of the NTP server, which is up here in the examples. I'll just take that first example, 0.pool.ntp.org, and then I'll click Setup Synchronization. With NTP configured, the next thing we said we needed to do is to create a partition and volume. To do that, I'll go into the Volumes tab, and then underneath Volumes, I'll go down here to create a new volume group and click on Create a New Physical Volume. Now we have two physical volumes here. We have dev SDA, which is the first VMware virtual thinly provisioned disk we created, the 100 gigabyte virtual disk we created, and it's got 3 partitions on it already. That's the OpenFiler Linux-based operating system. The next virtual disk we have here is dev SDB. This is, again, a thinly provisioned 100 gigabyte disk, and right now it doesn't have any partitions on it. So I'm just going to click on that disk, and then we'll scroll down here to create a partition in dev SDB. So to do that, it's going to be a primary volume. It will be a physical volume, and we'll use all the disk space we have, all 100 gigabytes. So all we have to do here is click Create. Okay, now you can see we've got a approximately 100 gigabyte virtual disk created. This is our new volume. This will be soon our iSCSI SAN. The next thing we need to do is to create a volume group. So I'll go here to Add Volume, and I'll go down here to the volume group name, and I'll just type in vSphere 5-iSCSI-1 to give this volume group a name. I'll select the new volume that we created there, and then I'll click Add Volume Group. The next thing we need to do is to create a new file system on this volume group. To do that, I'll go into Shares, and then I'll click here, Create a New File System Volume. I'll scroll down, and here's where we enter our volume name. I'll just type in iSCSI-1 for the volume name, and then for the volume description, I'll put in that this is a vSphere 5 iSCSI SAN for testing. Required space, we can use all the space that's available here, really, all the way up to 97,632 megabytes. I'll just copy that and go down here and paste it in here. We'll use all the space, and then this is going to be a block device, an iSCSI block device. I'll click Create here. And with that, we created our iSCSI block file system. Now, it may not show up until we enable iSCSI. But the next thing we need to do before enabling iSCSI is to allow network access. This is done over under the System tab. And then this is done underneath the Network Access Configuration. So here I'm just going to enter iSCSI as the name. You can give it any name you want. And then I'm going to allow a specific network, in my case, my local LAN. And then we need to specify the network mask, which will be right here. In my case, I have a Class C network mask. And then this is going to be a share type of network access configuration. So I'll click Update here. All right, and now we have a new entry here underneath Network Access Configuration. So now let's go in and enable iSCSI. Let's go into Services. And then underneath Services, notice where it says iSCSI Target. That's what we want to enable. You do not want to enable iSCSI Initiator. You can think of iSCSI Initiator as being the client. In our case, we want to create an iSCSI server, which would be the target. So we do want it to start automatically at boot. So we click Enable right here. And then we want to go ahead and start the server. So we click Start right here. So now it's running, and we have successfully started our iSCSI target. All right, so we've got our services up and going. Now let's go ahead and go over to Volumes. And under Volumes, look down here, we've got the iSCSI volume created. We see that it is an iSCSI file system type, and we should be able to share this out using the iSCSI targets option right here. I'll click on iSCSI targets, and then this is the IQN. This is the iSCSI qualified name. You can think of it as a DNS host name. It has to be unique, and it's going to specify or represent this iSCSI target or this iSCSI storage area network. I'll click Add here to add the new iSCSI target. We can see it's been added. There are some advanced attributes we could edit here if we wanted to. In our case, those really aren't necessary to modify. I'll go to LUN mapping. Notice right now there's no LUNs mapped to this target. So what we need to do is to go down here. Here's our volume that we created, and I'll just click Map. All right, now we have a LUN mapped, and let's go to the network ACL. Right now, we've got a network rule that we created over underneath System. We need to change this to Allow. I'll click Update there. All right, now we're allowing the entire network, any iSCSI initiator out there, any client out there that wants to connect to this iSCSI SAN can do so at this point. If we go into CHAP authentication, this is where you can actually assign a username and a password to connect to the iSCSI SAN. I recommend that you do that, but you may want to first test to ensure that you can connect at all without any security. Once you can connect without security, then come back and add CHAP authentication and add that layer of security. You don't want to overly complicate the initial configuration. I recommend you configure and then test in layers and then add more configuration and retest. So we won't configure CHAP authentication at this point, but I do want to go over to Services and then go to iSCSI target setup here. And also notice that this is where you would configure CHAP discovery. So iSCSI CHAP discovery allows you to discover the storage area network, and then you can actually put CHAP on the individual LUN to access the LUN. So a couple different layers of CHAP security there can be enabled. So at this point, let's go to Status, and that completes the configuration of iSCSI on our OpenFiler VSA. With that, let's go back to our slides, and then I'll walk you through the process of connecting our ESXi version 5 server to the new OpenFiler VSA. At this point, you really could connect any iSCSI initiator out there. That means any Windows server could connect to this storage area network that we just created and format it, let's say, with the NTFS file system. However, once we connect to it with ESXi, we're actually going to create a VMFS volume on this iSCSI SAN volume that we just shared out. So you could, of course, share out multiple volumes and have different file systems on those different volumes. In our case, we've just shared out one volume, so whatever file system we format it with the first time, like VMFS, that's what it's going to be. So with that, we'll go back to our slides. And now let's talk about connecting vSphere to the OpenFiler iSCSI SAN. Now to configure a new ESXi server to use iSCSI, first you'll add a software iSCSI adapter. Then you'll configure the iSCSI adapter, most likely to use dynamic discovery. Of course, it depends how your iSCSI SAN is configured. Then enter the IP or the host name of the OpenFiler server and add CHAP credentials if necessary. Then perform a rescan. And if this is the first connection to the iSCSI SAN, you'll need to go to Add Storage and create a VMFS data store, actually formatting the iSCSI SAN volume with the VMFS file system. So now let me go over to my vSphere client and let me walk you through these steps, and we'll verify that ESXi can indeed talk to the new OpenFiler iSCSI VSA. Here in my vSphere client, I've added a brand new ESXi server. It's ESXi 5, and I did that for the purposes of demonstrating how to configure a brand new server to connect to the iSCSI SAN. So to get started, we'll select the server in the hosts and clusters inventory here, and then go over to the configuration tab. From here, we'll go to storage adapters, and notice right now we just have a couple block SCSI adapters and then another standard SCSI adapter. So we've got VMHBA 0, 32, and 1. What we want to do is go up here and click Add, and then this is where we'll add our software iSCSI adapter. And this is brand new in vSphere 5 or ESXi 5. Previously, it worked a little bit different than this. So I'll just take the default here of adding the software iSCSI adapter and saying OK. And it gives us a warning here that a new software iSCSI adapter will be added to the storage adapters list. And after it's been added, you can select the software iSCSI adapter in the list, then click on Properties to complete the configuration. That's exactly what we'll do. I'll say OK here. We can see we're changing the software Internet SCSI status down in our task list. And there we go. There's the new VMHBA 33. It is an iSCSI adapter, and you can see it has its own IQN there. To configure it, we'll go down to Properties. Notice that it's already enabled. You don't have to go in and enable it like you had to do in vSphere 4. From here, we can go into Dynamic Discovery and then into Add. All we have to do here is type in the host name of the iSCSI SAN. In our case, it's openfiler.wiredbraincoffee.com. If we were using CHAP, we could configure that here, or we can configure it over on the parent, as they call it, which is the general CHAP setup for the iSCSI adapter. Since we haven't configured that yet, I'll say Cancel and OK. Notice we added a new target down here, and there's the target in our list. From here, I can say Close, and it prompts me to rescan the host bus adapter. We want to go ahead and say Yes to see what volumes we find. And there we go. We did find a new device out there. You can see the name of it. You can see its status is mounted, 0 LUNs, type is a disk. It is an iSCSI. Its capacity is 95 gig. So it looks like we were able to successfully connect to the iSCSI SAN, but we haven't tried to put a virtual machine out there. Let's first go to Storage, and notice we still just have one data store. That's because this iSCSI SAN is brand new. We haven't yet formatted it with the VMFS file system. To do that, I need to click Add Storage here, and then this is going to be a disk or a LUN, which is iSCSI. It includes iSCSI. I'll click Next, and there we go. There's our OpenFiler SAN. I'll select the OpenFiler iSCSI SAN and click Next. And then let's format it with the VMFS 5 file system. That's the brand new vSphere 5 version of VMFS. I'll click Next here. It tells us that a partition will be created and used. I'll click Next. Let's give the data store a name. Let's call it OpenFiler iSCSI 100 gigabytes. I'll click Next here. We'll tell it to use the maximum space available, and click Next and Finish. Down here you can see that we're creating a VMFS data store. Alright, that task is completed, and you can see we have a new data store right here that this ESXi server can access. We got a lot of free space. Let's go ahead and try to put a virtual machine out there on the new OpenFiler iSCSI SAN. So I'll just right click here, I'll click Create New Virtual Machine, and I'll just go through here and take all the defaults. Let's just call this Test VM, for the purposes of demonstration, and we'll store it on the new OpenFiler iSCSI SAN. I'll click Next here. We'll just take all the defaults again, say Finish, and let's just verify that we can indeed create a new virtual machine on the OpenFiler iSCSI SAN. We're creating the virtual machine, and there we go. The new virtual machine's been created. Look over here on the storage. You can see it's using the OpenFiler SAN. I can right-click on it. I can browse the data store. We're browsing the iSCSI SAN, and we can see a virtual machine and its files have been created. Awesome. Total success here. We were able to create a new virtual OpenFiler iSCSI storage area network completely free as a virtual machine, configure our ESXi server to connect to it, format it with the VMFS file system, and put a virtual machine on it. So with that, let's go back to our slides, and let's review what we covered in this lesson. We started off by talking about why you should use OpenFiler to begin with. Well, hey, it's free. It allows you to test advanced features of vSphere like vMotion and storage vMotion, VMHA, DRS, all those things in a lab environment at no cost without having to purchase expensive hardware-based storage area network equipment. It allows you to use NFS as well as iSCSI, and it's relatively easy to use and configure. From there, I showed you how to download OpenFiler, we installed OpenFiler, and then I showed you how to configure OpenFiler as an iSCSI SAN. That's probably the trickiest thing that we did in this entire lesson. However, that configuration is very valuable because not only could you use that OpenFiler SAN to store your vSphere virtual infrastructure virtual machines on, but you could also store even Windows files on that same type of iSCSI SAN. You could even put OpenFiler on a physical server if you wanted to and use it for production. And then I ended the lesson by showing you how to connect vSphere, really ESXi, to the OpenFiler iSCSI SAN. What we did is I went to a brand new ESXi server. We added the software iSCSI adapter. We pointed it to the OpenFiler DNS name, and then we were able to communicate with it as a device after the rescan. From there, we formatted it with the VMFS5 file system, and then we created a new virtual machine on the OpenFiler iSCSI SAN. At this point, it's ready to use as a free virtual storage area network so that you can test out advanced vSphere features. Thanks for watching this lesson covering creating a free iSCSI SAN with OpenFiler.